border to border, coast to coast. It's time to cue the talent and meet our host. It's a podcast by George. All right, folks, it's showtime.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Well, we're going to be talking about the John Deere strike today, and right off the top, I got to correct myself and everybody else that does that. Folks, John Deere isn't on strike. The UAW is on strike at John Deere. I mean, that's what we're going to be talking about today. And joining us is Dr. Peter Orszem. He's a professor of economics at Iowa State University. But before we get to him, I thought I'd kind of give you my take on this, my startup. And a lot of it was reflected in some recent podcasts that I had. And one I wanted to make sure that folks got to see a film clip from. This is J.D. Neal. He's from Local 450 of the UAW in Des Moines. He's talking about the first offer that John Deere made. And I thought this was very revealing, and I think it has a lot to do with where we're at today. So here's J.D. Neal.
It pissed us off. 100%. You called me essential. We came to work every single day. And we continue to make you millions. Not millions, billions of dollars. And, you say you want to give us 5 to 6% up front. It's a slap in the face.
You know, one of the pillars of conservatism is breaking unions. One of the major and most often overlooked reasons that Ronald Reagan is so beloved by neocons on the political scene is because he basically broke a union. PATCO, if you'll remember that. That was back in the 80s. I was covering that, interviewing PATCO members, the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization. That's what they want to do. They want to get rid of these unions. And of course, the unions played a major role in American history, largely responsible for the New Deal and FDR, the policies that, have faded into antiquity. Union membership has plummeted in America. The unions became corporate partners with ownership in recent decades. And the pandemic appears to be changing that dynamic a little bit. Strikes at Frito-Lay, Kellogg's, Nabisco, and threats to strike at healthcare facilities and even in Hollywood have recently energized the left, which has largely given up on electoral politics as being a solution, folks. I got to tell you, any solution at all, that's evidenced by the capitulation by progressives on the infrastructure spending bill in Congress this week and the stripping out of most of the social and climate spending from the pending reconciliation bills. Republicans got what they wanted in the infrastructure bill, and now they're not going to go along with progressive demands in the reconciliation bill. Just wait and see. Just watch. And so my question, as always, on this podcast is, were they too dumb or were they in on it? Well, the John Deere strike is a big deal in both corporate America and organized labor. They know it, folks. It's high-stakes poker. So let's play a little poker. Let's welcome in our guest, as I mentioned. Dr. Peter Orszem is a professor of economics at Iowa State University. His fields of interest include labor economics, human capital, and agricultural economics. He joined Iowa State University as an assistant professor in 1982. He received a university professorship in 2003. Folks, he's got a PhD from Yale, and he's the author of the book Child Labor and Education in Latin America, an Economic Perspective. And when he's not teaching economics, you might someday catch him out on the nightclub scene. He's a stand-up comedian. Believe it or not, economics can be funny stuff, and he makes it so, and we're just delighted to have him on the show. Let's welcome him into a podcast by George. Dr. Orszem, welcome to Podcast by George.
Well, it's very nice to be invited. Thank you.
Well, I want to bring this up on screen here because this is some news, and it was just this morning, actually. And folks may have seen this. John Deere is running some ads. This one reads, "Our people are part of John Deere's future." That's why UAW represented John Deere employees are getting 3 things that no other UAW U.S. major manufacturer provides. Number 1, cost of living adjustments every 3 months to protect employees from inflation. Number 2, both a company-funded defined benefit pension plan and defined contribution plan 401k to provide employees with monthly pension payments and the benefit of tax-deferred savings. And number 3, an entirely new company-funded cash balance savings to provide employees with more retirement income and flexibility to use as they see fit after their career. I'm not even sure what that means. Maybe he can explain it to us. But I reached out immediately to Brian Rothenberg, who's been communicating with me a little bit. He's the UAW Director of Public Relations. What he told me was, and this is a quote, the UAW focuses on striking members on the picket line, and we will not bargain in the press. We continue to appreciate the overwhelming community support our members and their families are receiving during this challenging time. So, Doctor, I know you've seen that before, that kind of play in the press. It looks like John Deere is going to do that. The UAW says they're not. What's your take on how effective that is and the reasoning behind it?
Well, I think both both groups are trying to play out their role in the press, whether they say they are or not. And certainly there are enough workers who are being interviewed and their opinions being bandied about. So I do think that there is a little bit of effort on the part of management to try to equalize some of the bargaining position. They're really have the UAW holding a lot of the chips in this bargaining strategy. And the initial offer was not particularly compelling. I mean, the initial wage increase actually was lower than the annual rate of inflation that was announced the following day. Mm-hmm. And so when you have a start from that and then a 90%, an overwhelming rejection of that initial contract by the rank and file, it really puts the union in a very strong bargaining position. And I think management is trying to perhaps build up a little bit of public sentiment, but what they're really trying to do is to talk to the workers, right? So several of their workplaces voted for the contract. There were some rather substantial votes against in a few of the plants. And I think they're trying to indirectly speak to the rank and file to try to get them to get a little bit more nervous about whether or not this is going to be a long or drawn out strike. And I don't think either management nor labor really want a very long strike.
I know, as you mentioned, the UAW, they're talking a little bit. I went down to the picket line. I went down to the local and talked to J.D. Neal, and you saw that film clip of him. And at that time, overwhelming support for rejecting the first offer. As you mentioned now, this second offer comes along. It's not nearly so overwhelming. There are a lot of UAW members that voted to accept the second offer and to go back to work. In your experience, what's that dynamic like now? How has that changed? Is the solidarity a little less? Are these people a little less cohesive? Are they a little less unified? Or is it just following what their leadership is telling them, even though some of them voted against it?
Well, no, I think the workers are relatively cohesive. I mean, there's some other issues with the UAW, and I mean, there may be actually workers who are not as appreciative of the efforts of the UAW. Certainly some of the UAW's recent problems in the courts has contributed to that. And the UAW, for all intents and purposes, doesn't want to be agreeing to contracts that get voted down by the rank and file. So I do think there's a little bit of a separation between the leadership of the UAW and their members in this particular case. And I think that's getting played out a little bit as well. But if you read some of the comments in the press from some of the workers who voted against the second contract, it's not that they didn't think it was a much better contract. It's that they think that they can get an even better deal, and that this is a uniquely good opportunity to try to press for a better deal. And so I do think that that doesn't suggest that there's a lot of disagreement among the workers. It's just whether or not it's going to be worth it to push an additional week or two for a 5-year contract that's going to be a little bit better. But the second contract was considerably improved relative to the first one.
All right, let me bring this up on screen. Now, this is, we're going to go back to, this is from the AP. And there's a nice segue from what you were talking about. Deere wants striking workers not to expect a better offer. A Deere executive said Wednesday that the company wouldn't return to the bargaining table with striking workers because it wouldn't offer a better contract than the one they rejected that included immediate 10% raises. Okay, I'm kind of a wordsmith, Doc. I mean, I look at these things very closely, the writing of these articles and what these two sides say. One thing that's just kind of taken for granted, that a lot of people don't talk about very much is this bargaining table. Can you enlighten us? What is that all about, really? Are they in a conference room, around a table, or is this done by proxy somehow?
Well, I don't know how they're handling the negotiations are not public. And so how they're handling it, whether they're doing it by Zoom or around a table, in this pandemic environment, I do not know, but I suspect that they're hashing things out face to face. And I think both of them have a pretty good idea as to what the other side is trying to accomplish. I mean, the firm is, for example, why would they suggest that, well, we can step up production internationally in order to make up for lost production here in the United States? They're trying to signal that, they're willing to drag out an extended strike. But you don't want to do that when all your sales are going to be occurring in the next 2 months or so, right? You do not want to be not having parts in place and new equipment in place when, whether it's construction or agriculture or forestry, all those sectors of the economy did pretty well this year. And they're going to be wanting to replace some of their depreciated equipment or repairing their equipment over in the off season because they want to be ready to go when the spring comes. And all those are seasonal sectors, seasonal jobs, right? And so I suspect that when you say this is our last offer, it's not the last offer. Yeah. And maybe they're hoping that then if they sweeten the pot a little bit, people will go, well, we got him to go off that ledge there a little bit and walk it back and gave us something a little sweeter. And so maybe that's going to gain them a few more votes in the next round.
All unions, all labor contracts, all strikes are different. This one is really unusual. And it's kind of the times that we live in, and you alluded to that somewhat. We've got this pandemic that we're trying to get out of. We've got this worker shortage, which is interesting how this plays into this. We've got these record high profits by Deere and by farmers, which doesn't get reported very much. People don't understand. We're in the middle of a drought here. I thought it was going to be a horrible year. I'm talking to farmers. They're seeing the meter in the hopper in the combine come in at 200 plus bushels to the acre sometimes. Corn's $5 a bushel, Doc. I mean, that's $1,000 an acre. If you have 1,000 acres, that's $1 million gross that these farmers have. That's cash in hand that they're ready to spend. And that plays into this. And the really unique or interesting thing, again, that a lot of people don't talk about, John Deere's a very unusual company in the way that they own a category when it comes to tractors and combines in particular. And I'm reminded of kind of like of Caterpillar in the heavy equipment category, or maybe for other people, they might think of Harley Davidson in the motorcycle category or something like that. They've got a commanding presence in their category and market share that they can control. So they don't have to be maybe as concerned about that as other companies would be. Can you kind of talk about all of those things or knit that together?
Well, certainly there's a lot of product loyalty on the part of people who use John Deere, and that's particularly true in the case of agriculture. Perhaps not as true in the case of forestry or construction, where that degree of product loyalty isn't quite as strong. But in all of these cases, if you need to have equipment that's ready to go in the field in March or April, and you're not able to get it, you're going to go to a competitor, and there are plenty of places that are more than happy to sell you agricultural equipment and not just John Deere. And so, once again, I don't think management is going to want to have an extended strike. They don't want to be going into December, for example, and have shortages of equipment and replacement parts, because that's when they're going to be. That's when farmers are going to be making their purchasing decisions.
What's your take on the UAW? Because we're thinking about it exclusively with an agricultural manufacturer here, but normally people think about the UAW and Detroit and the automakers and their past dealings in that category. Is there anything to be drawn from that to what we're experiencing now?
Well, I don't think. I mean, they may not have contracts coming up, and so it's probably not correct to say that they wouldn't be as anxious to come to an impasse on a contract with one of the automobile manufacturers as they are with John Deere. But automobile manufacturers have been hit more heavily by some of the supply side, some of the supply chain disruptions, and so. Under those circumstances, if you really can't, build something, a strike isn't going to cost you very much. And John Deere has a lot more of their parts that they're able to still source, and so I don't think that it's the same circumstances for UAW in the John Deere case as it is, say, with the automobiles. So. I think that when you look at where you're going to see strikes or where you're more likely to see labor disputes in the U.S., they're going to be strategic, right? Where is it that you have firms that have done particularly well? I mean, John Deere's stock price more than doubled since the start of the pandemic. Yes. Remember, they were laying people off in 2019. The market turned around remarkably for them across the board, across all their product lines. That puts the firm in a particularly strong position as far as being able to afford compensation increases. But it also, if you're wanting to expand and you announce that you can't fill 300 open lines, that puts labor in an extremely good position in the John Deere case. They wouldn't be in that strong a position in some of the other firms where UAW represents the workers.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about, I heard a little of this about John Deere trying to maybe protect other agricultural manufacturers in the sector. On the other side of the coin would be the UAW trying to uplift and incentivize and energize other unions and other categories. I look at that and I think, nah, John Deere's they're in this for themselves solely, and the UAW, I think they'd be maybe the first ones to tell you that they're in this almost solely for themselves. I mean, that's what they're supposed to be doing. Is there any other dynamic outside of that?
Well, I do remember seeing one of the officials with the AFL-CIO saying, the world is watching what's happening at John Deere. And the first time you see that, you could almost see somebody at UAW going, no, we don't want to be negotiating for all labor. We want to negotiate for the people that we represent. And, the history of the labor movement in the United States has a lot of unsuccessful labor unions that were more concerned with, say, the politics of the labor movement as they were with the nuts and bolts conditions and privileges of employment. And the reason why unions became successful and grew so much between the 1930s and the late 1950s was because they were able to deliver compensation terms and improved working conditions for their members.
Let me bring this back up on screen again. I want to make sure that I'm not overlooking something because I highlighted a lot of things in this article that I wanted to talk to you about. Um, you know, the part about keeping their costs competitive, is that with a company that's grossing $6 billion a year and has the almost tripling of a stock price, way over double, as you mentioned? I mean, is that really a concern? Are they concerned about remaining competitive?
Well, they're wanting to have a 5-year contract, and so if you're looking over that span, I mean, they don't want to have their costs out of line with their competitors. But they're producing really high cost equipment, and so they know that they have some market power in terms of the ability to pass the costs on to their customers, but it's not unlimited, and so of course they're going to be worried about that. But I don't think that the second offer was that far off what you might think would be an affordable fair offer from the standpoint of management. How much more they can go? They could probably go a little bit, but I think that the movement from the first contract was considerable. And what I'm actually curious is whether or not there's going to be a shorter contract. It's sort of hard to plan out over a 5-year trajectory, especially when we have the sudden surge of inflation. And there are reasons why it's more difficult to reach a settlement between labor and management when you're not quite sure what the value of the dollar is going to be 3, 4, or 5 years down the road. And they do have these cost of living adjustments that they've added in that were not in the last contract. The reason they're doing that now is because they don't know what the value of the dollar is going to be down the road. And so they're trying to build in some additional security or protection against the loss of purchasing power that wasn't there in the past contracts. And I suspect that one of the other ways of trying to remove some of that uncertainty is simply to have a shorter contract and say we'll see where things stand 3 years down the road.
Well, before we leave you here today, a couple of big questions. I mean, the elephants in the room. I did hear a little something about moving some of this manufacturing offshore. Getting this, I mean, that strikes fear, terror, and dread and anger in the heart of any organized union member, obviously. But again, going back to what I said earlier, I look at Deere and what they make, and I think, they've been trying to do this offshore. There are other countries trying to manufacture this stuff. They can't do it. They can't compete. I don't know that that's a real option for Deere. Is it or not?
Well, it is an option, but, the equipment's pretty big and it's expensive to ship. And most of the production that occurs in other countries is aimed at customers in those countries. And that's why they're in so many places. If I were to hazard a guess, if they think that they have, the Waterloo plant is a substantially large plant, but if they think that labor is easier to work with in some of their other plants than it is in Waterloo, you might see some production shifting among their U.S. Plants, and that's, I think, the more likely scenario if they feel that they're more likely to have cooperation in some of the other plants than they are in the ones that substantially voted down this second contract. But it's not going to happen overnight. I mean, you cannot shift production internationally or even regionally very easily when those plants are designed to produce a particular product in an assembly line operation.
Okay, and maybe my final 2 cents here again. This elephant in the room. When this first offer came down, especially when it was revealed that Deere had the $6 billion year and that the CEO's pay increased 160%, the stock price almost tripled. That they wanted to end the pension for new hires and this little Mickey Mouse 5% raise that was in there. I looked at that and I thought, what is this? They're not trying to break the union, are they? I mean, and then I looked at this second offer that came down. And I thought, well, they did move. I mean, and they moved fairly quickly, and they did offer much more than they did the first time around. But that's the other big elephant, Doc. People look at this and they always wonder: is this a move by a big corporation to break a union, at least in their sector? Did you see any evidence of that at all?
Not really. I think that they've had a long-term relationship with the UAW. I think that they know that. I mean, where you see efforts to try to break a union, the firm isn't doing well, and you have a protracted strike because the firm isn't losing much by not producing, and those sorts of situations, typically the firm isn't doing well, and of course labor can only do as well as the firm, right? At some point, somebody has to generate revenue, and that revenue is going to get distributed among its inputs and then its stockholders, and so why did the CEO gets? I mean, the CEO is paid in predominantly in stock options. So when the stock price more than doubles, you're not. I mean, that's why that's such a large increase. He did not make that much when they were laying people off, let's say, and so I think that everybody knows what the issues are here. The company does well, but it's a cyclical industry, whether it's construction or forestry or agriculture. You've got to make hay when the sun shines, and so both labor and management know that they have to be making money now because they're also going to have the lean years, right? So there's going to be posturing, but you don't. Management does not plan not to negotiate with UAW 5 years from now, or whatever the extent of this contract is, and both sides know that at some point you have to be able to make money in these fat years because they have lean years down the road. But if you look at, I mean, in Iowa, the average wage increase over the last year, September 20 to September 21, hourly is 13%. In construction, in manufacturing is 11.6%. That's for production workers. It's less if you average in the non-production workers, the supervisory staff and management. But we know that good production workers are extremely hard to find right now, and John Deere doesn't want to lose them. And so they know that they need to come across with a much more credible offer, and they probably wish that they'd come up with something a little bit more attractive in that first round.
Well, there are more rounds to go. I mean, I don't know if it's a heavyweight bout or not, but there's 15 rounds. I don't know that we'll get to that, but I knew this would be great today, and I'm really glad that you came on the show. Dr. Peter Oraszum. Now, make sure I'm getting that pronunciation right.
Oraszum, but it's fine.
All right, Oraszum. Okay, make sure, because I want to have him back on, folks. But I also want to give you last word here as to what people should stay tuned to or what they should look for. Or you mentioned that, there's going to be additional rounds coming. Now, is there any way to predict or know what's to come?
Well, I think both the UAW and the John Deere management are sort of have a lot of pressure to come up with an agreement that's going to get approved the next time. UAW doesn't want to keep proposing contracts that are voted down by the rank and file, because that puts eventually that's going to put the UAW in a poor position when it comes to negotiations. And so I do think that there's going to be some give on the part of management. I'm curious to see if they're going to try to shorten the length of the contract, but maybe workers want a 5-year agreement and the certainty that entails. But I think in this particular case, there's an incentive on all parties to try to settle relatively quickly, because they know that neither the firm nor the workers are going to benefit from a protracted strike.
That's great. Dr. Peter Oruzan, thanks again for coming on this edition of Podcast by George.
Well, it's a pleasure to be asked. Thank you.
We'll get you back, that's for sure, because this is going to go on at least for a little while. We'll see how soon they settle. Hopefully soon for all involved. The workers want to settle, the corporation does, and let's make everybody happy. Let's hope.
And there'll be some more. I think conditions are ripe now for more negotiations that go to impasse, and particularly labor's in a particularly strong position when there just aren't enough workers to go around.
We'll check back. We'll talk again when it happens. And folks, if you like this, if you like a Podcast by George and this kind of expert analysis this is a big deal, folks. This is a big issue. This is one that they're going to be talking about for years, if not decades to come. And it's right here in our backyard, right in the heartland. So let's follow this and follow along with Podcast by George. You can see us on YouTube, of course, and on Facebook, and you can hear the audio podcasts any place that audio podcasts are heard, most notably the iHeartRadio app or iTunes. If you're an Apple user, you can get us there. And of course, we're also on Spotify and places where audio podcasts are heard. But that's going to do it. That is going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.